After looking like his Formula 1 career was over just a few years ago, Nico Hulkenberg has now been announced as a Sauber driver in 2025 and then an Audi driver when they joined Formula 1 in 2026. On the surface, this move makes a lot of sense. A solid German driver joining a major German manufacturer during their first steps into Formula 1. But that context of how Nico ended up in this position cannot be forgotten, because what we have seen over the past couple of years is one of the greatest F1 career revivals we have ever seen. And now, whilst to some this might sound a little bit harsh, I think it's fair to say that Nico Hulkenberg has actually underdelivered compared to what people thought he was going to achieve in his career. During the 2000s, he was a sensational young driver. From the moment he stepped into a race car, he basically either won championships or races in every single series that he competed in. He won the Formula BMW Championship in 2005 as a rookie, he was part of Germany's A1 GP winning team in 2007, and then he really made his mark by winning the Euro F3 title in 2008, and then the GP2 Championship in 2009, which at the time was the Formula 2 equivalent. The timing of his rise through the junior ranks was also very important. Keep in mind, this was right after Michael Schumacher had first retired from Formula 1 in 2006, and so Germany was already craving to find their next big star. He was also backed by DVAG and Decra, which were also Michael's main sponsors, and he was also managed by Willy Weber, who was Michael's manager as well. It's no surprise then that with all of that hype coming into Formula 1, he earned the nickname the next Schumacher. And now, when you step back and really think about that for a second, it was always going to be almost impossible to live up to that level of hype and that level of expectation. And in the end, the next Schumacher actually turned out to be Sebastian Vettel. Having said that, during the early part of his career, although his raw talent was obvious, he really struggled to establish himself on the grid because not only did he struggle to find a stable team, but he also seemed to always find himself in the wrong place and at the wrong time. When he made his debut for Williams in 2010 as a Williams junior driver, despite having a very promising rookie season, this coincided with the team hitting financial issues, with major sponsors RBS and Philips leaving for 2011. And so, to recover some of those financial losses, the team felt like they had no other choice other than to hire a driver with more budget and opted to drop Hulkenberg very late into 2010 in favor of Pastor Maldonado for 2011, who came with huge backing from Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA. And now, this was announced in late November, and as you can imagine, there wasn't exactly that many seats available that late into the season. In the end, Hulkenberg's only choice was to take a year out in 2011, which straight away halted his development, and he chose to sign with Force India as their test and reserve driver before returning to Formula 1 with Force India full-time in 2012. The next pivotal year for Nico would be 2013 for more reasons than one. Yet again, luck was not on his side as he left Force India and signed with Sauber, who were just coming off the back of a season in which they scored 126 points and finished with 4 podiums. However, the team took a massive nosedive the moment that Nico got there, and in 2013, they would score no podiums and finish with just 57 points, which were almost entirely scored by Nico. Worse still, one of the biggest what-ifs in Formula 1 history was revealed by ex-Mercedes team principal Ross Brawn, who admitted that for 2013, Nico Hulkenberg was the second choice to replace Michael Schumacher behind eventual Mercedes driver Lewis Hamilton. Now, had Hamilton not gone to Mercedes in 2013, and had that been Hulkenberg, well, then you can come up with all sorts of alternative realities of where Hulkenberg would be now and what he could have gone on to achieve in the hybrid era when Mercedes became the dominant force. The Sauber experiment for Nico didn't work. That was the last time that I think anyone really perceived him as a potential future race winner, let alone a world champion. And even though he went there with the intention of pushing for the Ferrari seat in 2014, given that Sauber had a technical partnership with Ferrari, he also missed out on that drive with Ferrari opting to take Kimi Raikkonen alongside Fernando Alonso. And Nico spent just one season at Sauber before coming back to Force India for the new hybrid era, and in a way, that was the first right move that he made in his Formula 1 career, as the team would benefit hugely from having the Mercedes power unit. In Nico's early career was such a mixed bag because, whilst off-track he was struggling to find a stable home, on-track he had numerous moments of absolute brilliance mixed with immense disappointment. The talent was obvious right from the start, with performances like qualifying on pole position at the Brazilian Grand Prix in his rookie season, but then that was also mixed with moments of cracking under pressure when big results were on the table, like crashing into Hamilton in Brazil in 2012 when he could have been on the podium. By 2014, the talk of Nico Hulkenberg being a future world champion was now long gone, but I think he was finally able to settle down and find his place on the Formula 1 grid. During this time, he went on to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 2015, with now Audi CEO Andreas Seidel as his team principal, which just reminded people of the caliber of driver that he was when he had competitive machinery. Within Formula 1, Nico Hulkenberg established himself as one of the most consistent and most dependable drivers in the midfield. He was apolitical, he never had any problems with any of his teammates, he was never involved in any controversies, but at the same time, he never quite had that X factor, and he was never quite that driver that you could count on to bag a big result on a crazy day. During the 3 years when he was teammates with Checo, they made up one of the strongest driver pairings in the midfield, and it's no surprise that Force India had their best seasons during those years. Even though Hulkenberg had the edge over Checo in qualifying, there was no denying that on the Sunday, Checo was the superior driver. He was much better at managing his tyres, which was a key limitation for Nico during this period, and whether you want to say that it was all down to luck, which I don't, when podiums were on the table, it was always Checo who scored all 4 of them for Force India during this period. In 2017, when he moved to the newly returning Renault Works team, it felt very similar to his move to Audi now. Force India was a very good team, but as we have found out, without massive backing or manufacturer support, they were never going to be anything more than a podium contender. In Renault, Nico saw his chance to join a team with a lot more potential for the future. And whilst he remained a very highly rated midfield driver, more and more people started to talk about his reputation for not being able to capitalize when big opportunities to score podiums were on the table, like in Baku 2017 or Germany 2019. Every 5 or so years in F1, when one team finds a really talented young driver, it seems like every other team also starts feeling like they need to latch onto that trend and get their own young driver to basically future-proof the team. Hulkenberg got caught up in this influx of young drivers because not only did we have Verstappen and Leclerc establishing themselves in top teams, but we also had talents like Lando Norris, George Russell, and Alex Albon all make their F1 debuts. By 2019, with Ricciardo joining the team as their race-winning star driver and superseding Hulkenberg by beating him in their first season as teammates, it opened the door for Renault to replace him. And to be fair, I have always said that regardless of how good you are or how good you've been in the past, if you're getting beaten by your teammate, then it already gives the team at least one reason to drop you. Unsurprisingly, the team went with someone young. Esteban Ocon, who was previously a Renault Junior before switching to Mercedes and was spending a year on the sidelines after making his full debut in 2017, was the obvious choice. And now looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think that this switch was necessarily good or bad by Renault, but I do think that it was once again a case of bad timing for Hulkenberg. Esteban Ocon is still there right now, so at the very least he has been incredibly loyal to the team, and although he wasn't the most consistent driver on his comeback in 2020, he still managed to score them a podium on his return, and then in 2021 when the team became Alpine, he managed to score them their first ever Grand Prix win. The bigger problem for Nico was that his future options at the points that he was dropped were now running very thin. Williams, Alfa Romeo and Red Bull all had seats available, and in a bid to be Max's teammate for 2020, Nico chose to gamble and wait it out for Red Bull to make a decision. In the end, every single one of those teams went with a driver that was younger than Nico Hulkenberg, and just like that, he was out of Formula 1. Now, under most circumstances, I think people rightly so thought that it was over for Nico Hulkenberg. Once you drop off the Formula 1 grid, especially for a second time, people tend to forget about you. And unless you are a world champion like Fernando Alonso was, and have a huge resume and reputation to help you get back onto the grid, for a driver who hadn't even scored a podium in his F1 career, I think few could have predicted that we'd ever see Nico back full time. That didn't stop him, however, and what transpired over the next 3 years, I think is nothing short of remarkable. For 2020, during the COVID season, Nico signed for a third time with his old home Force India, who are now rebranded as Racing Point, as their reserve driver. Now, it feels uncomfortable to call it luck because these drivers ended up catching COVID, but the truth is that for Nico, that's what it was. Out of all of the drivers on the grid to miss races due to COVID, both of the Racing Point drivers missed races. Checo was out for the British and 70th anniversary Grand Prix, and Lance missed the Eiffel Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. On top of that, the car that Nico stepped into wasn't just a decent point-scoring car. It was the famous pink Mercedes, which in 2020 was the third best car on the grid, and still to this day is the best car that Nico has ever driven. The British Grand Prix turned out to be more of an acclimatization weekend for him, given that he found out that he was driving less than 24 hours before he had to be in the car. Around a track that he knew very well, in a car that he had never driven, he qualified 13th overall, but unfortunately he failed to even start the race due to a power unit issue. Luckily for him, however, he got a second bite of the cherry as Formula 1 hosted back-to-back races at Silverstone. And this time, for the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, Nico managed to qualify third on the grid, only behind the two dominant Mercedes, with his teammate Lance Stroll, who had been in the car all season, down in 6th. Now, in the race, he would drop back, finishing in 7th, but that qualifying performance alone reminded people of just how good of a driver we had sitting on the sidelines. The last time Nico would be in the car that season was in the Eiffel Grand Prix, and this time he was even less prepared. He only found out that he would be driving before qualifying, so literally the first time that the man jumped in the car was at the beginning of Q1, and so understandably with absolutely no practice, he qualified last to start the race. However, scoring points is what this man does, and yet again he executed a great race, climbing all the way from last place to finish in P8. Now, although he turned a lot of heads with his stand-in performances, it didn't quite materialize into a full-time drive. Red Bull went with Sergio Perez, Alfa Romeo chose continuity with Raikkonen and Giovinazzi, and Haas, after the pandemic, were in such a problematic position financially that they were basically forced to hire two rookies who brought in money, with Nikita Mazepin and F2 champion Mick Schumacher. The longer you spend on the F1 sidelines, the more you're forgotten about. After not securing a seat for 2021, he spent the entire season without making a single appearance for the now rebranded Aston Martin team. And although for 2022 he was once again in contention for the Williams drive, which eventually went to Alex Albon, he was pretty honest about his future, saying that, "I have no illusions. The doors of the top teams are closed for me. I have to be realistic. If it doesn't happen now, the Formula 1 chapter is closed for me." Just when you thought, however, that we'd never see Hulk again in Formula 1, to start the 2022 season, Sebastian Vettel tested positive for COVID, and so Hulkenberg was once again parachuted in as his replacement. Now, the 2022 Aston Martin was nowhere near as good as the 2020 Racing Point, and so his points scoring heroics were going to be unlikely. But even compared to Stroll, he still showed that he had lost none of his speed on the sidelines. In the first qualifying session of the season, Hulkenberg once again outqualified Stroll before finishing the race down in 17th. And with Seb not being able to compete in the following race, Hulkenberg also got a full weekend next time out in Jeddah, qualifying in 18th and finishing the race ahead of Stroll in 12th. And now, whilst these super sub performances might not look that impressive on the surface, under the circumstances, he was always very competitive against all of the full-time drivers in the other car, despite not having the same level of familiarity with either the car or the team. And it just kept Hulkenberg's name in the paddock enough for him to still be an option to a team looking for an experienced and safe pair of hands. I honestly think that without those 5 races, which turned out to be only 4 starts, I don't think that Nico would have found his way back into Formula 1. When you're out of Formula 1 for 3 years, no one is looking at you as a serious option. Nico got incredibly lucky to race as much as he did, but he also capitalized on the opportunities that were handed to him, and people noticed. In the end, his big opportunity turned out to be with Haas, who were going through a torrid few seasons. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the double rookie experiment had failed in 2021, as both drivers were clashing and crashing with each other both on and off the track. Even when Mazepin was booted out the team in early 2022 for K-Mag, it was then Mick who went on to have a nightmare season as he got outperformed by his teammate, had multiple big crashes that dented his confidence and the team's budget cap, and more than anything else, he and his family also started to have clashes with Günther Steiner. I have said this a million times on my channel, but Haas under Günther Steiner was never a team for a young driver, let alone 2 of them. What they needed was to add another experienced driver that would bring stability and calmness to the team. And so, after 3 years out of Formula 1, Hulkenberg's comeback for 2023 was finally announced. And now, it's very easy to forget based off what Nico has gone on to do, but his comeback wasn't exactly met with universal praise. There was a lot of fans, and trust me, I remember them, that complained about the idea of a driver in his mid-30s after 3 years out the sport, replacing a younger driver. The phrase, "he's had his chance, so why not give it to someone else," was being thrown around a lot. But as I said at the time, this move made sense for Haas, and despite the pressure that was on Nico's shoulders coming into 2023, it didn't take long for him to silence his critics and justify Haas's decision to drop Mick Schumacher. Last season, the Haas was on average the worst car on the grid based on its constructor's position, and in particular the team had real issues with the disparity from their qualifying pace to their race pace. Even though points were difficult to come by, Nico scored 9 of the team's 12 total points and also beat K-Mag both in their quali and race head-to-head. With the car's strength being in qualifying, this is where Nico really impressed and I think surprised a lot of people. In Canada, although he got lucky with the timing of the red flag, in tricky conditions he managed to qualify on the front row. And across the season, I was stunned to find out that Nico Hulkenberg's average qualifying position in 2023 was better than drivers like Tsunoda, Albon, and Stroll in the Aston Martin. The same Aston Martin that his teammate was scoring podiums with. This season, he has managed to carry over that strong momentum, scoring points 4 times in the opening 6 races, and more important than anything else, securing his future and reuniting with his Le Mans winning team principal by signing a multi-year deal that will see him race at Sauber in 2025 and then Audi's works team from 2026 onwards. In the space of 2 years, Nico has gone from a driver who no one thought we'd ever see back on the F1 grid to securing one of the most sought-after drives in the midfield, and all of that despite having never scored a win or podium in his career. Don't get me wrong, I would love to see Nico score at least 1 podium before he finally hangs up his helmet, but his record of being the driver with the most F1 starts without scoring a win or podium has never been indicative of the caliber of driver that he still is right now. Kevin Magnussen has a podium to his name, but that hasn't helped him beat Hulkenberg. Looking at the big picture, ranking Nico Hulkenberg is always going to be very difficult because there's always going to be loads of people, in my opinion, that both over and underrate him as a driver. He'll never be one of the best drivers on the grid, and I stand by what I said earlier that, relative to expectations and relative to the talent that I know he has, I do think that he's underdelivered in his career. The record that he holds for not scoring a single podium is one that he has a big part to play in with the mistakes that he has made. But he's also proved to a lot of people that, despite his age, even when he looked to be gone forever, it's his ability that got him back and has kept him on the grid. Regardless of how things pan out at Sauber/Audi and who his teammate is going to be, in my opinion, Nico's already won. He might not be the most popular driver on the grid or the one that gets all the clicks and all the attention, but his comeback and the level of tenacity and resilience that he had to show to make it happen is nothing short of inspirational. And his career revival arc after being forgotten about has been nothing short of remarkable. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then do please consider subscribing. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.